In 1887, on a trek into what he called the darkest part of Africa, a deadly, sunless expanse of jungle, famed explorer Henry Morton Stanley suffered through torrential rains and waist-deep mud while fending off incessant swarms of stinging flies and biting ants. And he and his team were weakened by continual hunger, crippled by festering sores and ulcers, and incapacitated by malaria and dysentery. A lot of them died of disease and starvation. Others were maimed and killed and sometimes even eaten alive by natives who attacked them with poison arrows and spears. It was any adventurer's worst nightmare. Yet his European teammates marveled at his apparent strength of will. Even the native Africans had a special name for him, Bula Matari, breaker of rocks. All others blamed the wilderness for turning men into savages, but incredibly, Stanley said he actually benefited from the experience. In his day, Stanley's feats enthralled the public and awed artists and intellectuals. Russian writer Anton Chekhov declared that one Stanley was worth a dozen schools and 100 good books. Chekhov saw Stanley's stubborn resilience and his focus as truly personifying the highest moral strength. Even Mark Twain said about Stanley, "When I contrast what I've achieved in my measurably brief life with what Stanley has achieved in his possibly briefer life, the effect is to sweep utterly away the 10-story edifice of my own self-appreciation and to leave nothing behind but the cellar." Now, clearly, Stanley had a secret that allowed him to exercise such incredible, heroic willpower. So what was his secret? Turns out that his secret was that he was ruthless, but not in the way that you might think. He wasn't ruthless with his traveling companions or with the natives that he encountered. Instead, he was ruthless against himself. I'll explain that in just a minute. The bottom line is that Stanley was about 130 years ahead of his time. Turns out, he used long-term strategies of self-control in the wilderness that psychologists are just now beginning to understand. In 1999, renowned Carnegie Mellon psychologist George Lowenstein observed through multiple experiments what he now calls the hot-cold empathy gap. The empathy gap describes our tendency to underestimate how much emotions impact the decisions that we make. By default, we subconsciously reference our current feelings and attitudes to give us an idea of how we might behave in the future. But obviously, how we feel right now could be really different from how we'll feel in the moment. In other words, it's our inability during a cool, rational, peaceful moment to appreciate just how we might behave during the heat of passion and temptation. The Apostle Paul actually wrote about this nearly 2,000 years ago in his first letter to the believers in Corinth. He wrote, "Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall." In other words, turn up the heat and the unthinkable can suddenly become surprisingly thinkable. I said a moment ago that Stanley was ruthless against himself. Now, in describing his experience, Stanley wrote, "It's difficult for anyone who has not undergone experiences similar to ours to understand the amount of self-control that each of us had to exercise for 15 hours a day amid such surroundings as ours. At home, these men had no cause to show their natural savagery. But in Africa, they were deprived of civilized luxuries. Fever seized them. It wrecked their minds and their bodies. Good nature was banished by anxiety. Pleasantness was eliminated by toil. Cheerfulness yielded to internal anguish until they became but shadows, morally and physically, of what they had been in English society." He went on to say that the will must be strengthened to resist unholy desires and low passions. And that's one of the best allies that the conscience can have. Now, Stanley knew that at some level, what he called savagery lurks in all of us, and he was ruthless against that nature. In his research, Dr. Roy Baumeister is super clear that he believes willpower is humanity's greatest strength. But he also believes that the best strategy is not to rely on willpower in all situations. His advice is to use it strategically and to try to save some willpower for those moments when it's indispensable. Stanley's strategy to conserve his own willpower, a strategy that he used over and over and over again with great success, is what psychologists call pre-commitment. Now, the essence of this strategy is to lock yourself into a virtuous path. You make unwanted behaviors as impossible and or unthinkable as possible. If you do this repeatedly, then you will hopefully end up with something that we're just now beginning to fully understand: a habit. Science has made it abundantly clear that the people we think of as having tremendous self-control are always distinguished by their numerous strategic behaviors that take place more or less automatically. In other words, high self-control is really little more than good, productive habits. If willpower is humanity's greatest power, then habit is our superpower. Now, let's be clear. It takes some willpower and some self-control to establish patterns of healthy behavior. But that's the point. Self-control turns out to be the most effective when we use it to establish good habits and break bad habits. Okay, let me recap for you. Question: how did famed explorer Henry Morton Stanley stick the landing again and again against such overwhelming odds, and how can we do the same thing? First, like Stanley, we have to take Paul's advice in 1 Corinthians 10:12 when he says, "Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall." When we improve the way we think, we can improve our lives. In other words, a better mind equals a better life. So how do we take Paul's advice then? We start by recognizing the natural savagery and lawlessness, that caged beast, so to speak, that's in each of us, and it's just waiting for the opportunity to get loose and cause trouble. You already know what your beast looks like, and I know what mine looks like. And some are mildly mischievous, others are downright dangerous, but none of us is without. You can be sure of that. Then, like Stanley, you have to be ruthless against that beast, whatever it is that you personally consider to be, quote, an unholy desire and a low passion, end quote. I personally choose to define my unholy desires and low passions by comparing them to what I read in the Bible. Now, you may use a different measuring stick. That's up to you. Finally, once you've defined the unwanted behaviors, you set up pre-commitment strategies against them. Prepare for those heat-of-the-moment times by using your willpower, not to fight in the moment, but to establish good habits that can lock you in to what Dr. Baumeister called the virtuous path, and build your willpower stamina. Remember this phrase: little challenges met repetitively create willpower stamina. And that's how you rewire your brain so that you can stick the landing. Like Stanley's fellow explorer, some of us blame our circumstances for unleashing our natural savagery. But that's not the right way to think about your challenges. Like Stanley, you can actually benefit from them simply by improving the way you think about them. Even amidst our greatest challenges, a better mind always leads to a better life.